My family kicked me out for my perfect sister, but her secret changed everything. Hey Reddit, I'm Alex, 28, and my life recently fell apart because of my parents' obsession with my younger sister, Lily, 24. She's always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, while I was treated like an afterthought. But things took a turn for the worse when I was kicked out of the house, with my family siding with Lily over a situation that I had nothing to do with. I thought it was just more of the same favoritism, but the truth I uncovered changed everything. Here's the story of how my family's betrayal pushed me to the brink, and the shocking secret that turned their perfect world upside down. Growing up, it was always clear that my parents favored Lily. She was the baby of the family, sweet, smart, and everything they'd ever wanted in a child. From the moment she was born, it was like my parents had found their reason for living, and I was relegated to the sidelines. My dad, Mark, 56, and my mom, Linda, 54, doted on her constantly, showering her with praise and attention that I never seemed to receive. I was 4 years older, and while I wasn't a bad kid by any means, I was never as shiny or impressive as Lily. She was the kid with perfect grades, the star athlete, the one who made friends effortlessly and charmed everyone she met. I, on the other hand, was average, decent grades, a few friends, and no standout talents to speak of. I was the invisible one, the kid who got lost in the shadow of his sister's brilliance. The early years, constant comparisons. It started early. My parents never directly said that Lily was better, but their actions spoke volumes. When I was 8, I brought home a painting I'd worked hard on for a school art show. I remember being so proud, excitedly showing it to my parents, hoping for their approval. My mom looked at it, smiled, and said, "That's nice, Alex." But when Lily, who was only 4 at the time, scribbled some stick figures on a piece of paper, they praised her like she was the next Picasso. This dynamic only intensified as we got older. My achievements were met with polite acknowledgement, while Lily's were celebrated like the second coming. When I got my first soccer trophy, it was barely noticed, but when Lily won her first gymnastics medal, we had a family dinner, and my parents framed the medal to hang in the living room. Every little thing she did was a cause for celebration, and every time, I was reminded that I was second best. Middle school struggles, living in Lily's shadow. By the time I hit middle school, the favoritism was impossible to ignore. I'd work hard on projects and assignments, only to have my efforts overshadowed by whatever Lily was doing at the time. One year, I spent weeks preparing for the school spelling bee. I studied every night, determined to make my parents proud. I made it to the final round, but when I came home to share the news, my parents were too busy helping Lily with her latest science fair project to pay much attention. "Good job, Alex. But can you help your sister with her project? She's got a big competition coming up," Dad had said, not even looking up from Lily's work. It was like my accomplishments only mattered if they somehow benefited Lily. I felt invisible, as if no matter how hard I tried, I'd never be good enough. It wasn't just the big things either. Even small moments were laced with favoritism. If I wanted to hang out with friends, my parents would ask a million questions and set curfews, but when Lily wanted to go out, they'd hand her money and tell her to have fun. If I got a B on a test, it was a lecture about not applying myself, but if Lily got a B, it was a learning opportunity, a minor hiccup in an otherwise perfect record. Lily's teenage years were a whirlwind of achievements. She was valedictorian, the captain of the cheerleading squad, and she got into a prestigious university on a full scholarship. My parents couldn't have been prouder, and they made sure everyone knew it. Meanwhile, I struggled my way through college, working part-time jobs to help pay my tuition and rent, while Lily's expenses were fully covered by my parents. I didn't begrudge her success, but it hurt to see how differently we were treated. Early adulthood, the dynamic grows stronger. As we grew older, the favoritism only became more pronounced. I moved back home after college, trying to save money while I worked at a tech startup, hoping to launch my career. Lily, on the other hand, moved to the city, living in a swanky apartment that my parents helped her afford. She'd come home for holidays, and every time, it was like a royal visit. My parents would roll out the red carpet, cooking her favorite meals, planning family outings around her schedule, and acting like she was the second coming of Christ. I tried not to let it bother me, but it was impossible not to feel the sting of being constantly overlooked. My parents' house, once my home, felt more like a museum dedicated to Lily's achievements. Her trophies lined the shelves, her framed diplomas hung on the walls, and her old bedroom was kept pristine, as if she'd never left. My room, on the other hand, was turned into a storage space for random junk and old boxes, a clear indication of where I stood in the family hierarchy. Despite everything, I loved my sister. I didn't blame her for our parents' favoritism, and we got along well enough when we weren't being pitted against each other. But there was always an underlying tension, an unspoken competition that neither of us had signed up for. Lily thrived on the attention, and I had learned to survive on the scraps, always telling myself that one day, I'd finally be seen. Things took a turn for the worse earlier this year when Lily moved back home after quitting her job in the city. She claimed she needed a break, some time to find herself, and my parents welcomed her back with open arms, turning our already strained home life into a full-blown circus. They treated her like a guest of honor, catering to her every whim, while I felt like an intruder in my own house. Lily's return, a home no longer mine. Lily's return wasn't just a temporary visit. It quickly became clear that she had no intention of leaving anytime soon. She took over the house, treating it like her personal domain. My parents doted on her more than ever, buying her new clothes, covering her bills, and doing everything they could to make her comfortable. Meanwhile, I was still paying rent to live in the basement, working long hours at a job I hated just to make ends meet. The tension between us grew as Lily's presence began to overshadow everything. She'd host loud parties with her friends, leaving me to clean up the mess. She'd borrow my car without asking, returning it with an empty gas tank and a new scratch on the bumper. She'd take over the living room, blasting her music or watching TV at full volume while I tried to work from home. And through it all, my parents would defend her, telling me to be more understanding and give Lily some space. The breaking point, a night of chaos. The breaking point came one weekend when my parents went out of town, leaving me and Lily alone in the house. I'd been looking forward to having some peace and quiet, hoping to catch up on work and maybe relax for the first time in weeks. But Lily had other plans. She threw a huge party, inviting half the neighborhood, and turning our house into a nightclub. I tried to keep my cool, but when I found strangers rummaging through my things in the basement, I snapped. I confronted Lily, telling her that enough was enough and that she needed to respect my space. She just rolled her eyes, brushing me off like I was an annoying gnat. "Lighten up, Alex," she said with a smirk. "It's just a party. Stop being such a buzzkill." Things escalated quickly, and before I knew it, we were screaming at each other in the middle of the kitchen. I told her that she was selfish, that she never considered how her actions affected anyone else, and that I was tired of being treated like an afterthought in my own home. She fired back, calling me a loser who was jealous of her success, and accusing me of blaming her for my own failures. The argument got heated, and in a fit of rage, I knocked over a vase that had been sitting on the counter. It wasn't intentional, I was just waving my arms around, trying to get her to listen, but it shattered on the floor, and Lily went ballistic. She started crying, yelling that I'd done it on purpose, and before I could say anything, she ran upstairs and locked herself in her room. My parents' return, blame and betrayal. I was still fuming when my parents came home the next day, and the second they walked through the door, Lily launched into her version of events. She told them I'd attacked her, that I was out of control, and that I'd broken the vase in a fit of rage. I tried to explain that it was an accident, that she'd provoked me, but my parents didn't want to hear it. "Alex, we've had enough of this," Dad said, his voice stern. "You're always causing trouble, always making things difficult. We can't keep living like this." I was stunned. Me? Causing trouble? I'd been the one putting up with Lily's antics for months, bending over backward to keep the peace while she wreaked havoc. But none of that mattered. My parents took Lily's side without question, and within minutes, they'd made up their minds. "We think it's best if you move out," Mom said, her tone cold and final. "You're old enough to stand on your own, and this environment clearly isn't working for anyone." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. They were kicking me out, not Lily, their perfect, golden child who could do no wrong. I tried to protest, to plead my case, but it was no use. My parents were done listening, and they'd made it clear that their loyalty would always lie with Lily. I packed my things in a daze, shoving clothes and belongings into suitcases and garbage bags, and left the house without saying another word. I couldn't believe this was happening, that my own family had turned their backs on me because of a tantrum from my spoiled sister. I had nowhere to go, no plan, and no idea what I was going to do next. I ended up crashing on a friend's couch for a few days, trying to figure out my next move. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, hurt, and disbelief. I'd spent my whole life being second to Lily, but this was a new low. I'd been kicked out of my own home, cut off from the only family I had, all because my sister couldn't stand being told no. The struggle to move on. I called my parents a few times, hoping they'd come to their senses, but every call was the same. They were firmly on Lily's side, and any attempt I made to explain my perspective was met with indifference. "You need to learn to control your temper," Mom would say, as if I was some unruly child who'd thrown a tantrum. "We just want peace in the house." Peace? They wanted peace at the expense of my sanity. I tried to reason with them, to remind them of all the times I'd put up with Lily's behavior, but it was like talking to a brick wall. They were convinced that I was the problem, and there was no changing their minds. I managed to find a small, rundown apartment on the edge of town, nothing fancy, but it was all I could afford on my salary. I moved in with little more than a mattress, a few pieces of furniture, and the gnawing feeling that I'd been completely abandoned. I'd gone from having a home to barely scraping by, all because my sister had spun a story that my parents were too eager to believe. The weight of loneliness. Those first few weeks were some of the hardest of my life. I worked long hours at my job, trying to distract myself from the constant ache of being cut off from my family. Nights were the worst, when the loneliness would creep in, and I'd lie awake replaying the events that had led me here. I couldn't understand why my parents had chosen Lily over me, why they couldn't see how their favoritism had torn us apart. The silence of my new apartment was suffocating. I'd grown used to the background noise of family life, even if it often centered around Lily. Now, the quiet was a constant reminder of my isolation. I'd scroll through old photos on my phone, family vacations, birthdays, holidays, searching for moments when I'd felt included, but all I could see were the times I'd been on the outskirts, never quite part of the picture. I tried to reach out to Lily, hoping that maybe she'd feel some guilt for what had happened, but she ignored my messages. She was living it up at home, while I was struggling just to keep my head above water. The resentment I'd buried for years began to fester, turning into a bitterness that I couldn't shake. Leaning on friends and finding distractions. I started spending more time with my friend Josh, the one who'd let me crash at his place after I got kicked out. He was a good guy, always down for a drink and a bit of distraction. We'd hit up bars, shoot pool, and talk about everything except the mess that my life had become. It was a welcome escape, and for a while, I managed to convince myself that I didn't need my family, that I was better off without them. Josh had his own place, a small but cozy apartment filled with mismatched furniture and the lingering smell of takeout. It wasn't much, but it felt like a haven compared to my empty, unwelcoming space. We'd spend hours gaming, watching old movies, and pretending that everything was fine. Josh never pushed me to talk, but he was always there, a steady presence in the chaos of my life. But no matter how hard I tried to move on, the pain of their betrayal was always there, simmering just beneath the surface. I'd see families out together at the park, laughing and enjoying each other's company, and I'd feel an overwhelming sense of loss. I missed my parents, despite everything, and I missed the idea of a family that had never really existed. One evening, after a long day at work, I stopped by a local coffee shop to grab a drink and unwind. I was scrolling through my phone, lost in thought, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. I turned around, and to my surprise, I saw Lily sitting at a corner table, talking animatedly with a man I didn't recognize. They were huddled close, whispering and laughing, and it was clear that this wasn't just a casual meeting. A chance encounter, the man in the coffee shop. I watched them for a moment, feeling a mix of curiosity and anger. What was she doing here? And who was this guy? Part of me wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I decided against it. Instead, I pulled out my phone and discreetly snapped a few photos, figuring I'd deal with it later. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Lily had never mentioned dating anyone, and my parents certainly hadn't said anything. The guy looked older, maybe in his mid-30s, with a slick appearance that screamed trouble. Something about the whole scene didn't sit right with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Lily's sudden return home than she'd let on. Digging deeper, the truth about Robert. I started doing some digging, using every trick I'd learned from working in tech to track down information about the mystery man. It didn't take long to find him. His name was Robert, and he wasn't just some random guy. He was a high-profile lawyer who'd recently been disbarred for embezzlement and fraud. The more I read, the more it became clear that Robert wasn't someone you'd want to be associated with, let alone date. But the real shock came when I stumbled upon a series of articles that detailed Robert's involvement in a massive scandal involving insider trading and money laundering. He'd been part of a corrupt investment firm, and though he'd managed to avoid jail time, his reputation was in tatters. The firm had been dissolved, and several of his former colleagues were serving time for their roles in the scheme. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Why was Lily mixed up with someone like this? And why hadn't she told anyone? It didn't add up, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just a casual fling. Lily was hiding something big, and I was determined to find out what. Confronting Lily, the weight of her secrets. I decided to confront her the next time she was alone, hoping to get some answers. I showed up at my parents' house unannounced, catching Lily off guard as she lounged in the backyard. She looked surprised to see me, but I didn't waste any time. "Who's Robert?" I asked, holding up my phone with the pictures I'd taken at the coffee shop. Lily's face went pale, and I could see the panic in her eyes. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, but her nervous demeanor gave her away. "Don't lie to me, Lily. I know who he is, and I know what he's done. Why are you involved with someone like that?" Lily's facade crumbled, and she broke down, admitting that she'd met Robert during her time in the city. He'd promised her the world, fancy dinners, expensive gifts, and the kind of life she'd always dreamed of. But things had quickly spiraled out of control. She'd gotten caught up in his schemes, helping him launder money through fake investments without fully understanding the consequences. When the scandal broke, Lily panicked. She'd quit her job, cut ties with Robert, and moved back home, hoping to escape the mess she'd made. But Robert had followed her, threatening to expose her involvement unless she helped him access funds that he could no longer touch. She'd been meeting with him in secret, desperate to keep her involvement hidden from our parents. I was floored. This was the golden child? The sister who could do no wrong? She'd been living a double life, wrapped up in illegal activities, and dragging our family's reputation through the mud. All the while, my parents were completely oblivious, still treating her like the perfect daughter while blaming me for everything that went wrong. "You have to tell Mom and Dad," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and disbelief. "They need to know what's really going on." Lily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't, Alex. They'll never forgive me. They'll hate me. They deserve the truth," I insisted. "You can't keep lying to them, and I'm not going to cover for you." But Lily refused, begging me to keep her secret. She was terrified of losing our parents' love, of shattering the perfect image they had of her. I could see how scared she was, but I was done protecting her from the consequences of her actions. She'd put our family at risk, and it was time for her to face the fallout. The next day, I called my parents and asked to meet them at their house. I'd barely seen them since they'd kicked me out, and I could tell they were hesitant, but they agreed. I showed up feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading but also waiting for. I needed them to see the truth, to understand that their blind loyalty to Lily had put us all in danger. Revealing the secret, the hardest conversation. I sat them down in the living room, my heart pounding as I recounted everything Lily had told me. I showed them the photos, the articles, and all the evidence I'd gathered. I watched their faces shift from confusion to shock, and then to something I hadn't seen before: fear. My parents, who had always been so sure of Lily's perfection, were suddenly faced with the reality of who she was and what she'd done. Mom broke down, sobbing into her hands, while Dad sat in stunned silence, staring at the evidence as if trying to make sense of it all. I could see the devastation in their eyes. Their perfect image of Lily was shattered, and they were left grappling with the fallout. How could she do this? Mom kept repeating, her voice choked with tears. We trusted her. We trusted her. I felt a pang of sympathy, but also a sense of vindication. For years, I'd been dismissed, overlooked, and blamed, while Lily was put on a pedestal. Now, the truth was out, and they could no longer deny the damage their favoritism had caused. "We need to talk to her," Dad said finally, his voice tight with anger. "We need to get to the bottom of this." Lily's confession, facing the consequences. We called Lily downstairs, and for the first time, my parents confronted her without the usual coddling and excuses. Lily tried to deny everything at first, but faced with the evidence, she broke down and confessed. It was a painful, messy scene of tears, accusations, and the realization that their golden child wasn't who they thought she was. Lily pleaded for forgiveness, begging them to understand that she'd made a mistake, that she'd been manipulated by Robert and didn't know how to get out. My parents were furious but also heartbroken, torn between anger and a desperate need to protect her. "We'll figure this out," Dad said, trying to keep his composure. "But you need to own up to what you've done. No more lies, Lily. No more hiding." Lily nodded, and I could see the weight of her choices finally sinking in. My parents were shell-shocked, struggling to reconcile the daughter they thought they knew with the reality of her actions. It was a wake-up call that had been a long time coming, and as I watched them process it all, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. For the first time, they saw me. They saw that I wasn't the problem, that I'd been trying to hold things together while Lily's lies tore us apart. I wasn't looking for an apology or validation, but in that moment, I knew that I'd finally been heard. In the weeks that followed, my parents struggled to come to terms with Lily's betrayal. They hired a lawyer to help untangle her mess, and for the first time in her life, Lily was forced to take responsibility for her actions. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wondered if our family would ever recover from the damage that had been done. Reconciliation, slowly mending broken bonds. My relationship with my parents slowly began to heal. They apologized for how they'd treated me, admitting that they'd been blinded by their favoritism and had unfairly put all the blame on me. It was a difficult conversation, filled with tears and regrets, but it was a step in the right direction. For the first time, they really listened to how I felt. I told them about the years of being overshadowed, of feeling like I was never good enough, and how their unwavering support of Lily had made me feel invisible. They didn't try to defend their actions or make excuses. They just sat there, taking it all in, and for once, I felt like my voice mattered. I didn't move back home. I'd made a life for myself, and I was determined to keep moving forward. But my parents made an effort to rebuild our bond, inviting me over for dinners, calling just to check in, and making it clear that they were finally ready to be the supportive family I'd always wanted. Lily's road to redemption, a difficult journey. Lily, too, was trying to make amends. She enrolled in therapy, began volunteering at a local charity, and was slowly working to pay back the debts she'd accumulated. She'd lost the trust of our parents, but she was committed to earning it back, one step at a time. Her journey wasn't easy. There were moments when she'd break down, overwhelmed by the weight of her mistakes. She'd call me, crying about how much she'd screwed up, how she didn't know if she'd ever be able to make things right. I'd listen, offering what little comfort I could, but I knew that this was something she had to work through on her own. One afternoon, Lily and I went for a walk around the neighborhood, something we hadn't done in years. The tension between us was still there, but it was different now, less about competition and more about finding common ground. "I'm sorry, Alex," Lily said quietly as we walked. "For everything. I know I've hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I'm trying to be better." I looked at her, my little sister who'd been the source of so much pain but was now just as lost as I'd been. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the genuine regret for what she'd done, and I realized that holding onto my anger wasn't going to change the past. "I'm not perfect either, Lily," I said, my voice soft. "But we're still family. We've both messed up, but maybe we can figure it out together." Lily nodded, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same page. We weren't the perfect siblings, and our family was far from flawless, but we were learning, growing, and trying to rebuild what had been lost. Life didn't magically get easier, but it felt different, more honest, more real. I started focusing on my own goals, pursuing a promotion at work, and even getting back into some of the hobbies I'd abandoned over the years. I spent more time with my parents, rebuilding the bond that had been strained for so long, and for the first time, they treated me as an equal, not just an afterthought. Rebuilding myself, a new path forward. I found a sense of peace in the small things, waking up early for a morning run, cooking meals in my tiny kitchen, and decorating my apartment to make it feel like a home. I wasn't living in anyone's shadow anymore, and that freedom was intoxicating. I started taking evening classes in coding, hoping to transition into a new role at work, and for the first time, I felt like I was building something just for me. Josh remained a constant support, pushing me to keep moving forward even on the days when it felt impossible. He'd drag me out to concerts, introduce me to new people, and remind me that my life was just beginning. It wasn't about escaping anymore, it was about embracing the possibilities that lay ahead. Lily continued to work on herself, slowly but surely rebuilding her life and her relationship with our parents. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, and plenty of tough conversations, but we were all committed to moving forward. We'd been through hell, but we were still standing, still trying to make things right. A family dinner, new beginnings. One evening, as we gathered for a family dinner, I looked around the table and felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. We weren't perfect, and we never would be, but we were trying. We were learning to see each other for who we really were, flaws and all, and that was enough. My parents, once so blinded by their own expectations, were finally learning to let go of the perfect image they'd clung to. They were learning to love us not for who they wanted us to be, but for who we were, imperfect, messy, and still finding our way. To anyone out there dealing with family drama, know that you're not alone. It's okay to feel hurt, to be angry, and to demand better. But it's also okay to forgive, to let go, and to rebuild in your own time. We're all just doing the best we can, and sometimes, that's enough. Thank you for listening, Reddit. This journey has been full of twists, turns, and unexpected truths, but it's also been a lesson in resilience, growth, and the power of facing the past head-on. Here's to new beginnings, to family, and to finding your own way.